Okay, so we've talked about a lot of different ways to understand populations and what they're doing, and kind of some important parameters we need to make decisions about different species. Um, an important thing is how we categorize different populations or different species. The IUCN is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, has a red list. And this is where they go through all different kinds of species and they categorize them into these different categories. And so you can see there's some things we've already talked about. So extinct, and this means globally extinct. So no individuals left anywhere in the world. We have extinct in the wild, which, if you'll remember, means there's only individuals in captivity. We have critically endangered, which means they have an extremely high risk of extinction. Endangered, a very high risk of extinction. Vulnerable means they have a high risk of extinction. Then we have near threatened, which is kind of medium. They're not doing great, but they're not about to blink out. We have least concern, which means for all we know, they seem to be doing just fine. Their populations are stable. We don't expect them to go extinct anytime soon. And data deficient means that we really don't have enough information about the species to put it in one of these other categories. If it's data deficient, it's unlikely to be extinct, but it's possible that there are some species that are extinct that are data deficient. And so we have different criteria. The IUCN is relatively precise in defining what they mean by these different categories. So this is an example. This is a table from your book, and it shows the different criteria the red list uses to designate a species as critically endangered. And so they only have to meet one of these criteria, and it'll be critically endangered. So, an observable reduction in number of individuals if the population has declined by 80% or more over the last 10 years or 3 generations, either based on direct observation or inferred factors such as level of exploitation, threats from introduced species, disease, habitat destruction, etc. They could also look at the total geographic area. If the species range is less than 100 kilometers squared at a single location, and there are observed threats like habitat loss, fragmentation, or exploitation, then it could be considered critically endangered. They could look at a predicted decline in number of individuals. And you can see some of these things might be determined by a population viability analysis. So the total population size is less than 250 mature breeding individuals and is expected to decline 25% or more within 3 years or 1 generation. Number of mature individuals currently alive, if it's less than 50. And the probability the species will go extinct within a certain number of years or generation. So if the extinction probability is greater than 50% within 10 years or 3 generations. And you can see this is something we would get from a population viability analysis. In practice, as we said, it can often be difficult to create a population viability analysis to come up with some of these numbers robustly. The easiest one to do is to measure how the geographic area occupied by the species. And so this is the one that's most commonly used. And so if the species its range is less than 100 kilometers squared, that's the most frequent way they get to be classified as critically endangered. Unfortunately, there are too many species that fall in these categories and not enough resources to do something about it. So I said that this would be more optimistic, but it's not 100% optimistic. Conservation biology is a crisis discipline, meaning that sometimes we have to make really hard decisions, often without enough information. There is triage going on. We don't have enough resources to put towards every species, unfortunately. So triage, if you're well, I guess now that we're in the pandemic, most of you may know what triage is, but it's the idea that in an emergency room, if too many individuals come in, Sometimes they try to prioritize individuals. Which individuals, if you go into the emergency room and it's packed and you broke your arm, you're not going to die in the next 12 hours. So you might have to wait a really long time. Whereas somebody comes in with a heart attack, they're going to try to treat right away, because if they wait, they might die. And so that's triage. That's prioritizing based on how soon we think something needs help. Or maybe even by importance. You might get triaged if you're not as important to something. So, like, they might treat the vice president before they treat me, for example. So, in conservation, what do you think are some different ways we could prioritize? So, I want you to pause this and think about that for a second. How should we decide which species to put our limited resources towards and which to hope things turn out okay? Similarly, what should be protected? What should we focus resources on? So conservation biologists have come up with a lot of different ways to prioritize, and sometimes these match up with reality and sometimes they don't. There's a species approach where we prioritize species we want to protect, a focal species. We might prioritize an indicator species, so a species associated with an endangered ecosystem or a unique ecosystem process. For example, beavers are ecosystem engineers. If we're in a place where beavers are declining, it might help a lot of other species if we focus our efforts on making sure there are beavers for the future, and that might help other species. Flagship species. These are ones with a lot of public attention. So this might be something like a panda. It's usually things that are furry and cuddly and very adorable looking end up being flag species. And the idea is that if we can get people to care about and donate money to this one, there may be other species that live in their same habitats that also benefit. Umbrella species is sort of that thing I was talking about. We might pick something that is wide-ranging or that is in a place where lots of other species need protecting, and we focus on this one species, and it's going to hopefully protect automatically lots of other species. That's an umbrella species. We might also use the ecosystem approach. We might preserve more species if we focus on ecosystems, and we can also demonstrate value more easily due to ecosystem services. So like, we really need to protect these wetlands because they protect us from hurricane surges, or they store and clean water. Things like that might be easier than, say, we really want to preserve this endangered rabbit. People might be, it is fuzzy, but it might be easier to demonstrate value and that resources should go towards this if we focus on ecosystem services. Another approach is wilderness, and this is an idea that we preserve very large blocks of land with minimal human disturbance, and if we do that, then lots of species will be preserved and lots of ecosystem services may also be preserved. And so it's a slightly different approach. Another one is the hotspot approach, and the idea here is that we protect those biodiversity hotspots. There are places with extremely high numbers of species, high amounts of endemism, and potentially under immediate threat. If we do that, we might get the most bang for our buck because we can protect the most endangered or likely to become endangered species in a single area.